I am here to tell you something about the tradition of the German Krimi films, which are based on a kind of literature which is also called Krimi. In German, it is the abbreviation of the phrase Kriminalroman, criminal novel. And the criminal novel has its sources in the mid to late 18th century fiction, which is also very close to Gothic fiction. The mysteries of Edgar Allan Poe, but also the Sherlock Holmes detective stories by Arthur Conan Doyle are the forerunners of things which were later developed by Edgar Wallace, Agatha Christie or James Hadley Case. These novels were translated into German and were very popular in the 1920s and 30s. That was a time when Edgar Wallace, the British author, was very popular in Germany, and he knew that. Although he died in the early 30s, he enjoyed his success in Germany, especially during the 1920s. He wrote a whole tradition of adventure novels playing in Africa, and that led to his last work, which was the story of King Kong, filmed in 1931. So he was kind of the inventor of the King Kong myth. And he wrote a lot of criminal novels which were very close to the tradition of Gothic fiction, because they worked a lot with haunted or abandoned houses, and most of his novels took place in a certain kind of London which was portrayed as the realm of criminal acts. And he was regarded in Germany very close to the Dr. Mabuse novels by Norbert Jack. And when those novels were filmed in the late 1920s by Fritz Lang, there was also the first attempt in German cinema, in the silent movies, to film novels by Edgar Wallace already. After the Second World War, there was a publisher called Goldmann, and Goldmann produced a new series of paperbacks with criminal novels which is called Rote Krimis, red criminal novels, because the cover was red simply, and which is very close to the phenomenon of the Italian Giallo, which means yellow, and also refers to thrillers and criminal novels published in yellow covers. So the red paperbacks were very popular in the 40s and 50s after the Second World War, and mainly were the basis for later German genre cinema, which became very popular in the late 50s and 60s then.
Don't miss The Sinister Monk.
When it comes to the cinematic era of the Krimi films in the late 50s and 60s, these films cannot be imagined without their precursors in German Expressionism, for example. German Expressionism is the tendency of the 1920s. Films like Nosferatu by Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau and Das Kabinett des Dr. Caligari, Cabinet of Caligari. And those films were also very close to the idea and the plots of Gothic fiction, but also created a kind of very chiaroscuro light and shadow play with bizarre formations within the images, which was a very unique style, very low-key style of cinematic art, which was very typical for the 1920s in Germany. And also Fritz Lang was partly influenced by this tendency when he made his criminal sound film, in fact, M. M is probably one of those films very close to later Krimi films of the 60s, because it is a kind of hunting for a serial killer. There's also influence by American film noir, because there is a huge tendency of German film artists emigrating from Nazi Germany into the USA in the late 30s and early 40s. So we have this German tendency within Hollywood, and then having an influence on German genre cinema after the Second World War again. And saying that, there's also glimpses of the French poetic realism of the 30s, which is also a kind of very dark cinematic tendency in some aspects. So if you take this together and then pair it with some aspects of British Hammer films of the 1950s, which were very popular at around the same time as the German Krimi films formed in the late 50s and early 60s. So there's a whole network of influences which was important for the black and white, very dark atmosphere of the German genre cinema at that time.
What kind of man has taken it upon himself to snuff out lives at his own whim? Is he backed by a foreign power? Is he a crazed maniac who kills because he has to? Who is the Frog Man?
There were very early attempts to adopt Edgar Wallace's novels for the screen in German cinema, but also in British cinema. So we have some cycles of Edgar Wallace adaptations, not only in Germany. And then we have one attempt in the mid-50s to film one of his novels, which was never completed, but the Danish producer Preben Philipsen, he discovered this material and had the idea to complete this film, which would have been the first Edgar Wallace film of the new cycle then, but instead he teamed up with Horst Wendland, which was the German producer and German counterpart, and he said, no, we will do a completely new film in this tradition, and they created the Fellowship of the Frog. Der Frosch mit der Maske. It's translated The Frog with a Mask if you take the German title at that time in 1958. And this film proved to be very successful and was the beginning of the actual popular Krimi cycle in the late 50s and 60s.
7 locks, 7 keys, 7 murders. Don't miss The Door with the 7 Locks.
Most of the films of the Edgar Wallace cycle are circling around a certain kind of mystery. And this mystery is signified, for example, by the element of the locked room, which is like a metaphorical place which contains the secret. And if you have the key to this room, you have the key to solve the secret. It works on a visual level in a way. It works as a kind of forbidden place, which has this element of transgression. So you have this element of the locked room, which is a kind of MacGuffin, because actually the mysteries laid out in these plots are not the key elements. They are the reason for all things going on. In the end, this might even be a kind of disappointment, because no mystery can be so big as the film suggests in the beginning.
Scotland Yard on the alert. One of the most diabolical killers in the history of crime is at large. The Squeaker.
The German Edgar Wallace films were obviously not shot in London, where they most of the time take place. The teams of those films had to find stand-ins for those locations. When, for example, the Thames and the River Thames and the harbor area is shown in those films, these scenes were shot in Hamburg, and they exchanged the street signs with English language signs at that time. Or they replaced the cars with certain English brands of cars. But if you look closely at a lot of those location shots, you will see that they sometimes forgot to change one of those signs, or that there are still elements of German culture and very many elements of German culture left. So it's a huge simulation of an English culture and English atmosphere within German studio film tradition.
Der grüne Bogenschütze.
If you regard the Edgar Wallace krimis of the 1960s as a cycle, then you have to say this cycle takes place from 1958 to 1972. And during that cycle, there have been some people reappearing on the side of the director's chair. Harald Reinl is a director who did a lot of those jobs that Fritz Lang did in the earlier ages. And he filmed, for example, Die Nibelungen, which is the saga of the Nibelungen, also filmed by Fritz Lang in the silent film era. And Harald Reinl also did some of the Karl May Winnetou films, the German Western. So you have the typical genre professional who is very skilled as a director and mainly achieves what he is aiming for. And then we have another director in German genre cinema, Alfred Vohra. Alfred Vohra, I remember, is often mentioned as one of the secret favorites by Quentin Tarantino, for example. He also is very skilled as a director of tension, and with the impact of Alfred Vohra on the Edgar Wallace cycle in the early 60s, these films changed a little bit in their tone. They became darker, more gothic, and closer to the horror genre. So most of these criminal films are very much on the borderline to horror films. And another very famous director is Jürgen Roland, a German director who later created a TV series, a Krimi series in the television in Germany called Stahlnetz, Steel Net in translation. And he kept a lot of the ideas of the series Edgar Wallace films and transported them onto the small screen of the television later. Concerning the actors which reoccurred in these films, we have Heinz Drache. He is a very popular actor who was famous for genre films and television appearances. And then we have Joachim Fuchsberger. For me, growing up as a child in the 1970s and early 80s in Germany, he was more famous as a show host actually in German television than as an actor. But I was very thrilled when I saw all those Edgar Wallace films and even some other German genre films called Das Mädchen von Hong Kong, The Girl from Hong Kong, where he played action roles. There were several female actresses reoccurring. Karin Dohr was one very famous for her physical beauty, obviously, as well as her very convincing appearance in several genre films in Germany.
The entire country lives in terror. The newspapers call the mad killer the sinister monk.
There are a lot of names. A very important seems to me the minor roles were casted with the same actors over and over again. Eddie Arendt is a comedian who was very popular for his sidekick appearances in minor roles in Edgar Wallace films, and these were elements of parody already present in the actual thriller movies. So they had a kind of comic relief moment when Eddie Arendt appears and makes some kind of silly joke.
Sie werden doch keinen Brillenträger schlagen.
And there was the very popular villain played by Klaus Kinski. Klaus Kinski was later very popular and world famous for his roles he played for Werner Herzog in films like Aguirre, Wrath of the Gods, or Fitzcarraldo. And he played a lot of the generic villain roles in Edgar Wallace films with his huge eyes and his crazy stare. And he is a kind of a very unpredictably behaving, very aggressive character in the Edgar Wallace films.
Hallo, hier spricht Edgar Wallace. Hello, here speaks Edgar Wallace.
There was a kind of trademark in these films beginning with the early 60s. Hallo, hier spricht Edgar Wallace. And this is a kind of verification that the brand Edgar Wallace is rightfully there. It is a signature in a way. And a funny thing is that this phrase was at some point spoken by the director Alfred Vohra himself. And it was so charismatic, this phrase, that it later appeared, for example, in the tradition, which is a very famous thing in Germany, the audio plays, recorded for cassettes, also adopting Edgar Wallace novels as a basis.
Es ist unmöglich, von Edgar Wallace nicht gefesselt zu sein.
And then you had these black and white films till the 1966, when the films were then produced in color, but there were also color elements in the early Edgar Wallace films which were connected with the titles. So after the initial crime being committed in a pre-title sequence, you have this Hallo, hier spricht Edgar Wallace, and then you have the title in a bright color like a bright red or bright green, and then you have a black and white film. So this was a certain very specific style of German genre cinema, very popular in the early 60s. In the beginning, the Danish producer Preben Philipsen and his Giallo Films were the sole production company, and they teamed up with Horst Wendland in the beginning, and then they had this German base to produce Edgar Wallace films. Later there was a co-production and a tendency by Arthur Brauner, also a very influential and very famous film producer in Germany, and he had the company CCC Films. In the later times of the cycle, there were also directors like Ricardo Freda, because the production moved a little bit from the purely German, Danish-German production towards international co-productions with Harry Allen Towers as the British producer and some Italian producers as well. Arthur Brauner also continued the tradition of the Edgar Wallace films in co-production with the Italian cinema when they created a whole cycle of Giallo thrillers in Italy, mainly shot in Italian locations by Italian directors like Dario Argento, and out came films like The Bird with the Crystal Plumage or Cat O' Nine Tails, which were then credited to novels by the son of Edgar Wallace, Brian Edgar Wallace, in the hope that people would mistake them in a way for Edgar Wallace films. But Brian Edgar Wallace was also a criminal novelist and writer, so he took over the popularity from his father, but he was never that much a brand like the name Edgar Wallace.
One of the most infamous killer figures in the library of fascinating detective stories by world-famous mystery novelist Edgar Wallace.
There was a huge influence on both sides between German genre film and Italians. You have to see the tradition of Italian genre cinema always is close to what is popular, and we will copy it. And this is not meant in a negative way, because there is a lot of quality in Italian genre cinema, obviously, probably even more so than in German genre cinema of that time. But there is a huge influence by Gialli films like Mario Bava's early Gialli, The Girl Who Knew Too Much, or Blood and Black Lace on the Edgar Wallace films. And from beginning with 1966, 1967, there were co-productions which brought this influence into the Italian cinema. So we have Italian Giallo thrillers very much in the vein of Edgar Wallace films, and they were marketed as kind of Edgar Wallace krimis in Germany at the same time. Most of these films did not that well on the box office compared to their German counterparts, which might have the reason that the original Edgar Wallace films were more aimed at a general and also a family audience, while the later Edgar Wallace films, which were much closer and even equivalent to the Giallo films, were more aiming at an adult audience and were very much dealing with more violence and sexuality.
Oh, what a pleasure! In the pink of health you are, my dear.
Does the monster kill at random? Or is it part of some diabolical scheme?
Excellent, Sir John. We're coming closer to it.
What? Closer? We're right on it.
At a certain point in the Edgar Wallace cycle, which is around 1961 to 1966, where this idea of parody of itself is inherent in the direction of these films. This is not really there in the beginning, and it is not really there in later co-productions with Italian cinema.
He's coming. I know he's coming.
Women.
It also directly leads to later parodies of these films, for example by the German comedian Otto Waalkes in the 80s, or we have a parody called Der Wichser, which is a pun on one of those very popular Edgar Wallace titles, Der Hexer, in translation, German translation, The Wanker. So this comedy plays on the level of a slapstick criminal adaptation of Edgar Wallace.
A specialist in thrillers prescribes just the thing that tenses your nerves.
The critical perception of these films was kind of skeptical from the beginning. Often the professionality of the direction was honored in a way, but most of these films were considered being as trivial as the novels by Edgar Wallace himself. So it was a tradition of trivial genre cinema. You have to see that cinema itself is not really regarded in the sense as an art form as you see in the Francophone or in the Anglo-Saxon market. In Germany, you have not the best reception of genre cinema in general. So the specific German genre cinema was not regarded as very high level as a cultural phenomenon.
Es geht ein Millionenvermögen.
There was a parallel phenomena with the success of the Edgar Wallace films already in the early 1960s. There were several cycles and series of film adaptations and even own cinematic series without any literature sources, which were very popular at that time. For example, there was the Pater Brown films, which is about a preacher detective, the Dr. Mabuse adaptations, which referred back to the success of Fritz Lang's early Dr. Mabuse films. And you have to see that in Germany, for example, the James Bond film series was also very popular. So they tried to combine the skills of German Krimi with international co-production within the series Kommissar X. The Kommissar X films were kind of mixture of Edgar Wallace and James Bond concepts. So you have a lot of attempts to cash into that tendency of successful German Krimi films at that time.
Das Rätsel der roten Orchidee.
This is also important to mention because you have the West German and the East German cinematic tradition. In East Germany, the Socialist Republic, you have a centralized studio called DEFA Film, and DEFA also produced genre films at that time, at the 60s. So there was also a kind of influence between West and East German cinema. But in the 70s, this changed a little bit. The concept of Edgar Wallace films was not that interesting anymore for the audiences. You had a huge success of German sex film, which is the series of films with simulated sex, soft pornography, which was very popular in the beginning of the 70s in Germany. So the audience was longing for something else. People tend to forget that there was a tradition of German genre cinema, which is lacking today. But it was there in the 50s. There were melodramas which played on the countryside called Heimatfilm. There were German war films, very popular German war films, very huge productions about the Second World War. And there were, for example, the Karl May adaptations, the Winnetou films, German westerns, very close and parallel to the Italian spaghetti western. And there was the tradition of the Krimi.